Brazil's first black Supreme Court justice appears to be eyeing another historic breakthrough for the country, the nation's first black president. Former Supreme Court Chief Justice Joaquim Barbosa is set to join the Brazilian Socialist Party, or PSB. The 63-year-old gained notoriety during the nation's infamous corruption trial involving former President Lula da Silva's government. Lula was charged with corruption in connection to that case and faces 6 other corruption charges. The Supreme Court is expected to rule on Wednesday whether he should be jailed sometime in the near future. He does, however, still plan to seek re-election this fall. To help us break this all down, let's bring in CBSN contributor Alex Kliment. He writes for Signal. That's a newsletter produced by G0 Media. All right, so this is such a fascinating story, what's happening over in Brazil. What more can you tell us first about Barbosa's background?
Well, his backstory is as compelling as they come. He was born into a poor family, 8 siblings, born to an impoverished bricklayer. His first job in a courtroom was actually as a janitor. He rose, as you say, to become Brazil's first black Supreme Court justice and ended up leading the Supreme Court at the time of this massive corruption trial, which ensnared the government of former President Lula. He's known for being very blunt and outspoken. He's also known for having very progressive views on social issues, such as same-sex marriage and affirmative action. So his entry into the race really is a remarkable turning point and could really turn this thing upside down.
I mean, what's his base like? Because there's been we've talked a lot about Brazilian politics over the last couple of weeks, and a country where more than half the population, or almost half the population, is of African origin, and some people identify even as mixed race. Is his appeal simply to those individuals, or does it have a wider appeal?
No, I think it's much broader than that. I mean, you have to remember that this electoral cycle in Brazil is being defined above all by voters' frustration with corruption, with the political status quo, and so on. So Barbosa actually comes in quite an advantageous position. He's nationally well known, but he's not tainted by party politics, and he has proven credentials as an anti-corruption crusader, fighting corruption at the very highest levels of the government. So all of those things will give him appeal to a potentially broad sector of the electorate, but of course also his liberal social positions and his background will make him particularly competitive on the Brazilian left, which at the moment is being led principally by former President Lula, who despite his convictions is still intending to run for office and is leading in the polls. He may be in jail by the time the election happens.
which is remarkable for people in this country who are following this story, how somebody could possibly land in jail and still be running for the presidency of a major, Brazil's not a, they're a major player on the world stage.
Yeah, it's the largest economy in Latin America. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the paradoxes of an incredibly polarized electoral cycle in Brazil. I mean, the polarization in Brazil, Americans can understand it, right? But this is really, I mean, things have gotten so bad that Lula's motorcade was pelted with rocks and eggs last week. Someone shot at his car during a campaign tour. So this is really, the electoral cycle is extremely ugly. And I think Barbosa actually can come into that and present himself as somehow outside of and above all of that for the reasons that we discussed. Look, I think at the same time his inexperience could be a liability, right? Brazilian party politics is extraordinarily brutal, and his lack of experience can be an asset at the beginning, but it can become a liability. So we've yet to see whether he can really translate this potential into a strong candidacy, but it's certainly the potential is there.
So the corruption in Brazil is so notorious. There's even a Netflix. Have you seen this Netflix series? Yeah, right.
Which has caused quite a backlash in Brazil, actually.
Because?
Well, because it exposes this venal corruption at all levels of government.
It feels like people already know that in Brazil. So this is now, I think, a show like this, the mechanism is for people who are not that familiar with the corruption in Brazil, who watch it. But if you're in Brazil, you're watching this, you're thinking to yourself, what else is new?
Yeah, well, I think there's also a bit of concern about how it makes Brazil look to outsiders, right? It's one thing to criticize your own family,
internally,
but if someone outside is doing it, it becomes a different story entirely. But it depicts a reality that is shaping the political and social conditions in Brazil right now, which is that corruption is the #1 issue on voters' minds, and it's fomented a very anti-establishment sentiment amongst the electorate as we head for the election.
The show is sort of loosely fictional, right? I mean, it's not really but everybody can figure out who's who, who's Lula, who's Dilma Rousseff. Are people watching it in Brazil? Is it popular, even if they don't like it?
Well, you have to ask a Brazilian, but yeah, people are certainly aware of it.
Yeah.
I mean, we wrote this piece about Barbosa in this morning's Signal, and I've already gotten 2 emails that mention the Padilha series.
Oh, that's hilarious.
So it's on people's minds for sure.
All right, let's talk hard numbers today. 5,499.
So as of last week, Turkish President Erdogan has been in power both as Prime Minister and as President for 5,499 days. That surpasses Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, as the longest-serving leader of post-Ottoman Turkey. And it's interesting to think back on how Erdogan was viewed when he first came to power in 2003. He was seen as a reformist candidate.
I remember.
Right? I mean, he had a lot of support outside of Turkey.
He had a lot of support in Europe.
In Europe,
a lot of European leaders thought this was a major play for Turkey to enter, to be part of sort of the modern Europe, as opposed to seen as not.
Well, and he was seen as a guy who could bridge the gap between Islamist politics and democracy very neatly. In the years since, he's gone in a much more nationalistic, conservative, and kind of authoritarian direction, which has dashed a lot of those hopes that people both inside and outside Turkey had in 2003. But he still has a strong support base because of those things.
All right, 62.
62. So the current Indian defense budget is $62 billion, which passes an interesting milestone, which is that this is the first time since India achieved independence from Great Britain, from the United Kingdom rather, that India's defense budget is larger than the United Kingdom's. So a sign of shifting balances of power in the world over the past 50 years.
All right, and the last one, 0.
0. China's coal exports to its main client state in North Korea dropped from about 8,500 tons a month last year to a grand total of 0 earlier this year. This is part of the economic pressure campaign that China is putting on North Korea in order to drive Kim Jong-un towards a diplomatic solution on the nuclear crisis.
It does, when you see a number like that, people, I think, can understand why it's being done, but you realize that people who are already suffering immensely are going to suffer even more, although it is getting warmer. I mean, we're going into the spring and summer months, but it's pretty devastating to the people who don't have anything already.
Well, this is one of the issues with sanctions more broadly, is that in general they tend not to hurt the people who they're supposed to affect.
Exactly. Alex Kliment, always great to have you, my friend. Thank you.
My pleasure.
You can check out all of these stories and more by subscribing to the Signal newsletter. Sign up for it at g0media.com.